The pen shook in Claire Whitmore's hand as the lawyer slid the paper across the table. She did not look at Daniel Hart. She looked only at the line where her name was supposed to go, and for a moment she could not make her fingers move. "You can still walk away," the lawyer said, though his tone made it clear that no one in the room believed that was true. Claire glanced at her father, sitting in a wheelchair by the window, his breathing thin and slow. The hospital bracelet was still on his wrist from the visit 2 days earlier. That was the only reason she was here. That was the only reason any of this made sense. She signed her name. Daniel signed his without hesitation, his expression as unreadable as it had been since he walked into the room. He did not smile. He did not offer his hand. He simply nodded once to the lawyer, then to his mother, Evelyn Hart, who stood near the door with her arms crossed and satisfaction written plainly across her face. "It is done," Evelyn said. "The company is safe." Claire wanted to say something about how this was not just about a company, that a woman's whole life had just been folded into a piece of paper, but she said nothing. She had learned, in the last few weeks, that saying nothing was easier than saying too much. The wedding happened 4 days later. It was small, fast, and cold, held in a private hall with only a handful of witnesses. Claire wore a dress that had been chosen for her, not by her. Daniel wore a suit that fit him the way armor fits a soldier who has stopped noticing the weight of it. When the officiant asked if he took Claire to be his wife, Daniel said, "I do," the same way he might approve a business contract. When Claire said her own vow, her voice barely rose above a whisper. No one clapped when it was over. No one cried, except for her father, who wept quietly from his chair, grateful and guilty in equal measure. That night, Daniel drove her to his house in silence. The city lights passed over the windows in long streaks, and Claire watched them instead of watching him. She did not know what to say to a man she had just promised her life to and who had promised her nothing back. The house was large, modern, and empty in the way that expensive things are sometimes empty. Daniel showed her to a room on the second floor, apart from his own, and told her that the housekeeper would help her settle in. Then he left for his office, even though it was already past 9 at night. Claire sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after he was gone. She thought about her father, alone in his hospital room, finally receiving the treatment he needed because of the money this marriage had brought him. She thought about the life she had imagined for herself once, a life that had nothing to do with contracts or company mergers, or a husband who could not look at her without calculating what she was worth. She did not cry. She had promised herself she would not cry over this. Instead, she opened the small suitcase she had brought and began putting her things away, one careful item at a time, as if organizing her clothes could somehow organize the rest of her life. Daniel did not come home until well past midnight. Claire heard the front door, heard his footsteps pause outside her room, then continue down the hallway to his own. He did not knock. She had not expected him to. In the days that followed, they settled into an arrangement more than a marriage. Daniel left early for his office, sometimes before Claire woke. He returned late, often after she had already eaten dinner alone at the long table in the dining room, a table built for a family that did not yet exist, and might never exist. Their conversations were short and practical. Did the housekeeper need anything? Was the car ready for the morning? Nothing more. Claire began to explore the house during the long empty hours. She found Daniel's study locked, but the rest of the house was hers to wander, and she wandered it like someone counting the walls of a room she had been placed inside. She found old photographs in a drawer, pictures of Daniel as a boy, laughing in a way she had not yet seen from the man she married. She wondered what had happened to that boy, what had hardened him into someone who signed a marriage contract without blinking. On the 5th day, Evelyn Hart came to visit. She arrived unannounced, walking through the house as though she still owned it, which in many ways she did. "You look well," Evelyn said, though her eyes moved over Claire with the same appraising look she might give a piece of furniture. "Daniel tells me you have settled in." "He hasn't told me much of anything," Claire replied, before she could stop herself. Evelyn's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "My son does not talk easily. He was not always like this. There was a time he laughed more than anyone I knew." She paused, glancing toward the hallway. "That time ended a few years ago. It is not my story to tell you why." Claire wanted to ask more, but Evelyn had already moved on to discussing the household staff, the upcoming company event Claire would be expected to attend, and the image the family needed to present to the public now that the merger was secure. There was no room in the conversation for softness. That evening, Daniel came home earlier than usual. Claire was in the kitchen, having asked the housekeeper for the evening off so she could cook something herself, something that reminded her of home. The smell of a simple stew filled the air when Daniel walked in, and he stopped in the doorway, surprised. "You cook," he said. It was not quite a question. "I used to, before." Claire stopped herself. Before her father got sick, before the money ran out, before this. "I used to," she said again, simpler this time. Daniel stood there a moment longer, watching her stir the pot, and something in his face shifted, though Claire could not name what it was. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by the same careful distance he wore like a second suit. "There's no need for you to cook," he said. "The staff can handle it." "I know," Claire said. "I wanted to." He did not argue further. He simply took off his jacket, hung it over a chair, and sat down at the small kitchen table instead of the long dining table, where he usually ate alone. Claire noticed, but said nothing. She placed a bowl in front of him without being asked, and for the first time since the wedding, they ate a meal in the same room, at the same time, in silence that felt slightly less cold than before. Later that night, after Daniel had gone to his study, Claire stood by the window of her room and looked out at the city. Somewhere across town, her father was resting easier because of what she had given up. She reminded herself of that whenever the loneliness pressed too hard against her chest. This was not a fairy tale. This was a trade, and she had made her choice with open eyes. But as she turned away from the window, she found herself thinking about the way Daniel had paused in the kitchen doorway, the flicker of something human behind his guarded eyes. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself not to hope. 2 floors below, Daniel sat at his desk with a stack of papers he was not truly reading. His mind kept drifting back to the kitchen, to the quiet woman who had cooked a meal no one asked her to cook, who had looked at him not with fear or flattery, but with something steadier, something he did not have a name for yet. He had married her for the company. He had told himself that 100 times since the contract was signed. But sitting there in the dark, staring at numbers that refused to make sense, he could not stop thinking about the sound of her voice when she said she used to cook, before. Before what, he did not know. He realized, with quiet unease, that he wanted to know. He closed the folder in front of him and rubbed his eyes. Tomorrow there would be another long day of meetings, another performance of the successful businessman who had secured everything he needed. But for the first time in a long while, Daniel Hart was aware of something missing from his careful, calculated life. Something that had walked into his house 4 days ago wearing a borrowed dress and a brave, quiet face. He did not yet know her, not really. But some quiet, stubborn part of him had already begun to wonder what it would take to. Claire had not always been someone who accepted her fate quietly. Growing up, she had dreamed of running a small flower shop of her own, filled with color and the smell of fresh soil. A modest dream that had nothing to do with company mergers or grand houses. Her mother had died when she was young, leaving Henry to raise her alone on a school teacher's modest income, and the two of them had built a life together that was simple but full of warmth. It was that warmth Claire missed most in Daniel's house, the easy laughter over a shared meal, the comfort of knowing someone cared whether her day had been good or difficult. When Henry first fell ill, Claire had exhausted every option she could find. She had taken extra work, sold what little jewelry her mother left behind, even considered selling the small house they had always called home. None of it had been enough. When Evelyn Hart approached her with the proposal, dressed carefully as a business opportunity rather than a desperate trade, Claire had recognized it immediately for what it was, but she had also recognized that pride would not save her father's life. She had agreed within a day, telling herself it was simply another sacrifice among many she had already made. What she had not expected was how deeply lonely the marriage would feel, even surrounded by the comfort and safety her father's medical bills now guaranteed. Money had solved one kind of hunger and revealed another, quieter one she had not known how to name until she found herself standing alone in an unfamiliar bedroom on her wedding night. On her 6th morning in the house, Claire rose early and wandered into the garden behind the property, a wide, neglected space that had clearly once been cared for but had fallen into disrepair in the years since. She knelt in the dirt without thinking, pulling weeds away from a cluster of roses that had somehow survived years of neglect, and found, for the first time since the wedding, a small measure of peace in the simple work of her hands. It was there that the housekeeper, an older woman named Margaret who had worked for the Hart family for over a decade, found her later that morning. "You have a gentle touch with growing things," Margaret said, watching Claire work. "This garden used to be beautiful before Mr. Ethan passed. Mrs. Hart could not bear to look at it afterward, and Mr. Daniel never had the heart to tend it either." Claire paused, her hands still in the soil. "Ethan was his brother?" Margaret nodded, her expression softening with old sympathy. A wonderful young man, the two of them were inseparable growing up. After the accident, it was as though half of this house's light went out with him, and nothing anyone has done since has managed to bring it back. Claire looked around at the overgrown garden, the neglected roses fighting valiantly against years of silence, and felt something settle quietly into place inside her, a sense of purpose she had not expected to find in this house of contracts and cold formality. Perhaps she could not fix whatever had broken between Daniel and the world after his brother's death, but perhaps, she thought, brushing the soil from her hands, she could at least tend to the small, neglected things that no one else had the heart to face. The phone rang at 6 in the morning, sharp and insistent against the quiet of the house. Claire answered before the second ring, her heart already racing, because a call at that hour never brought good news. It was the hospital. Her father's fever had spiked overnight. She was dressed and standing by the front door within minutes, car keys in hand, when Daniel appeared at the top of the stairs, still in the shirt he had worn the night before, as if he had never gone to bed. "What happened?" he asked, and for once his voice carried none of its usual careful distance. "My father. I need to go to the hospital." Claire's hand was already on the door. "I'll drive you," Daniel said, and before she could argue, he had grabbed his coat and was following her out into the gray morning light. The ride was silent except for the hum of the engine and the occasional siren in the distance. Claire stared out the window, her knuckles white against her knees, and Daniel glanced at her more than once, unsure of what to say, unsure if there was anything to say that would help. At the hospital, Claire moved through the hallways like someone who had walked them too many times before. Daniel followed a step behind, out of place in his expensive coat among the tired nurses and worried families, but he did not leave. He sat beside her in the waiting room chairs, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and when the doctor finally came out to explain that Henry Whitmore's condition had stabilized, Claire's whole body seemed to fold in on itself with relief. Daniel reached out, almost without thinking, and steadied her by the elbow. "He's going to be all right," he said quietly, and it was the gentlest thing he had said to her since they met. They stayed at the hospital most of the day. Claire sat beside her father's bed, holding his frail hand while he slept, and Daniel stood near the window, watching the two of them with an expression Claire could not quite decipher whenever she looked up. At one point, Henry Whitmore woke briefly, his eyes finding Daniel across the room. "Take care of her," the old man whispered, his voice barely more than breath. "She gave up everything for me. Don't let it be for nothing." Daniel did not answer right away. He simply nodded, and something in that small, silent promise seemed to settle heavier on him than any contract he had ever signed. On the drive home that evening, the silence between them had changed. It was no longer the cold, careful silence of two strangers avoiding each other. It was something quieter, something that felt almost like the beginning of trust. "Thank you," Claire finally said, "for staying." "You don't have to thank me," Daniel replied. "He's my family too now, or he will be, if this marriage means anything at all." Claire turned to look at him, surprised by the honesty in his voice. It was the first time he had spoken of the marriage as something more than an arrangement, and she did not know what to do with the small, cautious warmth that spread through her chest at his words. In the weeks that followed, something between them began to shift, slowly, like ice thinning over a lake in early spring. Daniel started coming home earlier, not every night, but often enough that Claire noticed. He began joining her at the small kitchen table instead of eating alone in his study. Their conversations grew longer, touching on small things at first: the weather, a book Claire was reading, a difficult meeting Daniel had endured that day. Neither of them spoke of feelings. Neither of them dared. One evening, Claire found Daniel in the study long after she thought he would be asleep. The door, usually locked, stood slightly open, and she could see him sitting at his desk, not working, but staring at an old photograph in his hands. She knocked softly before stepping inside. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said. Daniel looked up, startled, and for a moment considered putting the photograph away. Instead, he held it out to her. It showed a younger Daniel, perhaps 16, laughing beside another boy who looked remarkably like him. "My brother," Daniel said quietly. "Ethan. He died 6 years ago. Car accident." Claire's breath caught. "I'm so sorry." After that, my mother changed. Everything became about protecting what was left, about making sure the company survived no matter what it cost. She stopped seeing me as her son, and started seeing me as the last piece she had left to move on the board. Daniel's voice was flat, but Claire could hear the old grief buried underneath it, worn smooth by years of being pushed down. "Is that why you agreed to marry me?" Claire asked softly. "Because you stopped believing you had a choice?" Daniel looked at her for a long moment. I stopped believing choices mattered a long time ago. You do what needs to be done, and you don't waste time wishing things were different. He paused. But lately, I've started to wonder if that was the wrong way to live. Claire sat down across from him, the photograph still resting on the desk between them. My father always said that even a life built on hard choices can still have room for good ones. Maybe this doesn't have to be only a transaction. Something passed between them then, quiet and fragile, like the first crack of warmth in a long winter. Daniel reached over and, hesitantly, covered her hand with his own. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them moved away. That was the night everything began to change, slowly, carefully, the way trust always has to be built between two people who had been taught not to expect kindness from the world. But not everyone was pleased by the shift. At a company gala 2 weeks later, Claire stood at Daniel's side for the first time as his public wife, wearing a deep blue gown that Evelyn had personally chosen to project the right image. Daniel introduced her to partners and investors with a steady hand at her back, and for the first time, Claire felt less like a transaction and more like someone standing beside her husband because he wanted her there. Then, Victoria Lane arrived. She moved through the crowd like she owned it, her laughter carrying just a little too loudly, her eyes finding Daniel across the room with a familiarity that made Claire's stomach tighten. Victoria approached them with a practiced smile, kissing the air near Daniel's cheek before turning her attention to Claire. "So this is the wife," Victoria said, her voice sweet in a way that felt sharpened at the edges. "How wonderfully convenient for everyone." "Victoria," Daniel said, his tone carefully neutral, though Claire noticed the tension that had returned to his shoulders. "I only mean it kindly," Victoria continued, her gaze flicking briefly to Claire before settling back on Daniel. "We were so close once, weren't we? It's funny how business always seems to get in the way of the things that matter most." Claire said nothing, but she felt the old familiar coldness creeping back into the space between her and Daniel, as though the fragile warmth they had built over the past weeks might shatter under the weight of a woman who clearly believed she still had a claim on him. Daniel excused them both quickly, steering Claire away toward a quieter corner of the room, but the damage had already been done. Claire could not stop replaying Victoria's words, could not stop wondering how close they had really been, and what exactly business had gotten in the way of. "She means nothing," Daniel said once they were alone, sensing the shift in Claire's mood. "That was a long time ago, before everything with my brother, before any of this." "It doesn't matter," Claire said, though her voice betrayed that it did. "I just don't want to be caught in the middle of something I don't understand." Daniel studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You won't be. I promise you that." It was a promise made with good intentions, spoken in a quiet corner of a crowded room. But promises, Claire was beginning to learn, were only as strong as the people who tested them. And Victoria Lane did not look like a woman who gave up easily. Later that night, back home, Daniel walked Claire to her door, something he had never done before. He lingered there a moment, his hand resting lightly against the frame. "I know this isn't what either of us imagined for our lives," he said quietly. "But I don't want it to only be an arrangement anymore. Not for me." Claire looked up at him, her heart caught somewhere between hope and fear. "Neither do I," she admitted. For a moment, neither of them moved, the space between them charged with everything they had not yet said. Then Daniel stepped back, offering her a small, uncertain smile before turning down the hallway toward his own room. Claire closed her door and leaned against it, her heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. Something real was growing between them, fragile and new, and for the first time since the contract had been signed, she allowed herself to hope that this marriage might become something more than the trade it had started as. She did not yet know how quickly that hope would be tested. In the days after the gala, Claire found herself returning often to the garden Margaret had told her about, spending quiet mornings clearing away years of neglect before Daniel woke, wanting to give him something back without knowing exactly why it mattered so much to her. She did not tell him what she was doing, not at first, content to let the work remain her own private ritual, a small act of hope in a marriage still finding its footing. Daniel noticed anyway. He noticed the dirt beneath her fingernails at breakfast, the fresh flowers that began appearing in vases throughout the house, the faint smell of soil and roses that lingered in her hair when she sat beside him in the evenings. He said nothing about it for nearly 2 weeks, watching instead, curious, and quietly moved by her persistence with a garden that had defeated even the professional landscapers his mother once hired. One Saturday morning, he found her kneeling among the roses, sleeves rolled up, humming softly to herself the way she often did when she thought no one was listening. He stood at the edge of the garden for a long moment before she noticed him. "You've been busy," he said, gesturing toward the transformed beds. Weeks of careful work now beginning to show in the healthier color of the leaves, the fuller blooms pushing bravely toward the sun. Sat back on her heels, brushing a strand of hair from her face and leaving a small streak of dirt behind. "Margaret told me it used to belong to your brother. I thought, maybe someone should take care of it again." Daniel's expression shifted, something raw and unguarded passing briefly across his features before he composed himself. He crossed the garden and knelt down beside her, examining the roses she had coaxed back to life. Ethan planted these himself, actually. He always said a garden without roses was just a very expensive patch of grass. Claire laughed, a real laugh, the first one she had allowed herself fully in this house. "That sounds like something my father would say." "I think you would have liked him," Daniel said quietly. "Ethan, I mean. He had this way of making everything feel lighter, even things that weren't. After he died, I think I forgot how to let anything feel light at all. Maybe that's changing," Claire said softly, and Daniel, surprising himself as much as her, reached over and gently wiped the smudge of dirt from her cheek, his hand lingering a moment longer than the gesture required. It became a small ritual after that. Weekend mornings spent together in the garden, Daniel learning slowly from Claire which plants needed more water and which needed less shade, both of them working in comfortable silence broken occasionally by quiet conversation about nothing important and everything that mattered. It was in that garden, more than anywhere else in the house, that Claire first began to believe their marriage might grow into something neither of them had expected when the contract was signed. The company gala, when it arrived, felt like a disruption to the fragile peace they had built in those quiet mornings, a reminder that beyond the garden walls, the rest of the world still expected performance, image, and the careful management of appearances Daniel had spent his whole adult life maintaining. But Claire found, to her quiet surprise, that she no longer dreaded these public appearances the way she had at the wedding. Standing beside Daniel now felt different, less like being displayed and more like being chosen, even if neither of them had spoken the word aloud yet. She had picked her own gown for the gala this time, a deep blue that Evelyn had suggested but that Claire herself had approved, wanting for the first time to feel like an active participant in her own life, rather than a piece being moved carefully into place. As they dressed that evening, Daniel watched her fasten a simple pair of earrings, her reflection catching his in the mirror. "You look beautiful," he said, the words simple and unguarded in a way that surprised them both. "Thank you," Claire replied, feeling a warmth rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the earrings and everything to do with the honesty in his voice. The drive to the gala passed more easily than any of their previous outings, filled with small conversation about people they might see, about Nathan Cole's habit of telling the same 3 jokes at every company event, about Evelyn's insistence on a seating chart no one ever seemed to follow. For the first time, Claire found herself looking forward to an evening she once would have dreaded entirely. The message arrived on a quiet afternoon while Claire was arranging flowers in the hallway, humming softly to herself for the first time in weeks. Her phone buzzed once, then again, and when she finally looked at it, her chest tightened. It was an unknown number, and the message contained only a single photograph. In it, Daniel stood close to Victoria Lane outside a restaurant downtown, her hand resting on his arm, both of them caught mid-laugh, looking every bit like 2 people who shared an easy, private history. Beneath the photo, a short caption had been typed by whoever sent it. "Some marriages are only for show. Ask him where he really spends his evenings." Claire stared at the screen until the flowers she had been holding slipped from her hands and scattered across the floor. She told herself there had to be an explanation. Daniel had mentioned a late meeting downtown that day, something about renegotiating terms with an old business associate. She had not thought to ask which associate. Now the question sat in her stomach like a stone. When Daniel came home that evening, he found Claire sitting very still at the kitchen table, the phone placed carefully in front of her, screen up, the photograph still visible. "What is this?" she asked, her voice steady in a way that surprised even her. Daniel's face changed the moment he saw the image, a flash of something like alarm crossing his features before he composed himself. "It's not what it looks like. Victoria asked to meet about a shared investment from years ago. I should have told you, but I didn't think it mattered." "It matters that you didn't tell me," Claire said quietly. "It matters that someone thought this was worth sending to me at all. Someone who knew exactly where to find me." Daniel sat down across from her, his jaw tight. "I don't know who sent that, but I promise you, nothing happened. Victoria has always had a talent for making things look worse than they are." Claire wanted to believe him. Some part of her did believe him, the part that remembered the warmth in his voice the night he showed her his brother's photograph, the steady hand at her back during the gala, the quiet promise at her door. But another part of her, older and more guarded, whispered that trust built in a few short weeks could not withstand a challenge like this one so easily. "I need some time," she said finally, standing from the table. Daniel reached for her hand, but she pulled away gently, not out of anger, but out of the need to breathe, to think clearly, without the pull of his presence clouding her judgment. She went to her room and did not come down again that night, and Daniel sat alone at the table long after she had gone, staring at the photograph on the phone she had left behind, trying to understand how something he considered harmless had become a wound between them. The next morning, Nathan Cole, Daniel's business partner and closest friend, arrived at the office earlier than usual, finding Daniel already at his desk, looking as though he had not slept. "You look terrible," Nathan said, setting down a cup of coffee he had brought without being asked. "Victoria sent Claire a photograph," Daniel said flatly. "From the meeting yesterday. Someone must have taken it and forwarded it to her, made it look like something it wasn't." Nathan's expression shifted, a flicker of guilt crossing his face that Daniel did not immediately catch. "That's low, even for Victoria. You don't sound surprised." Nathan hesitated, choosing his next words carefully. "Daniel, I've heard some things. Around the office, from people who deal with her company. Victoria has not taken the marriage well. She's been telling people it's only a matter of time before it falls apart, that you married out of obligation and nothing more. I didn't think much of it until now." Daniel's hands curled into fists on the desk. "She's trying to break something that only just started to feel real." "Then don't let her," Nathan said simply. "Go home. Talk to your wife. Don't let pride keep you sitting in this office while everything you've been building falls apart because you're too proud to chase after what actually matters." Daniel knew Nathan was right, but the day did not allow for an easy exit. A crucial vote on the company's expansion plans required his presence. Hours of tense negotiation with shareholders who had no patience for a distracted chief executive. By the time Daniel finally made it home, it was well past 9, and the house was dark and silent in a way that made his stomach drop before he even opened the door. Claire was gone. Not permanently, not yet, but a note sat on the kitchen table in her careful handwriting, explaining that she had gone to stay with her friend Grace Bennett for a few days, that she needed space to think, that this was not the end of anything, but she could not stay in a house that felt, once again, like a room built around someone else's decisions. Daniel read the note 3 times before setting it down. He thought of his brother, of the years he had spent building walls so high that nothing could ever hurt him the way Ethan's death had, and he realized, standing alone in his too large, too quiet kitchen, that somewhere in the last few weeks, Claire had become the first person in a long time who could hurt him at all. That realization should have frightened him. Instead, it clarified something he had been too stubborn to admit. He did not chase after her that night. He told himself it was because she had asked for space, and he intended to respect that. But some quieter, more honest part of him knew that a lifetime of avoiding difficult conversations had trained him to retreat rather than pursue. Even now. Even when pursuing was exactly what the moment required. At Grace's small apartment across town, Claire sat curled on the couch, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands while her friend paced the room, indignant on her behalf. "You cannot just sit there and accept this," Grace said. "That woman sent you a photograph meant to hurt you, and instead of being angry at her, you're doubting the one person who actually seemed to be trying." "I'm not doubting him because of the photograph," Claire admitted quietly. "I'm doubting myself. I married him for my father's sake. I told myself I would never expect anything more than that. And now I've let myself hope for something real, and it terrifies me how much it would hurt to lose it." Grace sat down beside her, softening. "Then don't give up on it without a fight. If it's real, it's worth fighting for. If it's not, you'll know soon enough. But running away from the question won't give you the answer." Claire stared into her cooling tea, thinking of Daniel's hand covering hers over his brother's photograph, of the steady way he had held her at the hospital, of the small, uncertain smile he had given her outside her door. None of that matched the careless man Victoria wanted her to believe he was. But the ache of uncertainty remained, sharp and unresolved. 2 days passed with no word between them beyond a single short message from Daniel each evening, checking that she was safe, nothing more, respecting the space she had asked for even as it clearly cost him to do so. On the 3rd day, Claire returned home on her own, not because the uncertainty had resolved itself, but because she realized that avoiding the conversation would not make the truth any clearer. She found Daniel in the study again, the same room where he had first shown her his brother's photograph. He looked up when she entered, relief and caution warring across his face in equal measure. "I owe you the truth," he said before she could speak, standing from his desk. All of it, not just the parts that make me look good. Claire crossed her arms, bracing herself. Then tell me. Daniel told her everything, about Victoria, about the engagement that had ended years before Claire ever entered his life. Ended, not because Daniel wanted it to, but because Victoria had grown tired of waiting for a man too consumed by grief and business to give her the attention she demanded. He told Claire about the meeting, about the old shared investment that genuinely required discussion, about how he had not thought to mention it because, in his mind, it had meant nothing at all. I should have told you where I was going, he admitted. Not because I did anything wrong, but because you deserve to know, and I've spent so long only telling people what they needed to know for business that I forgot marriage requires more than that. Claire listened, weighing every word against everything she already knew of him, and slowly, the tight knot in her chest began to loosen. I believe you, she said finally, but I need you to understand something. I didn't run away because I thought you had done something wrong. I ran because I realized how much it would break me if you had, and that terrified me more than anything Victoria could ever send me. Daniel crossed the room and took her hands in his, more certain now than he had been at any point since their wedding day. Then let me prove to you, every day if I have to, that you were never a mistake, that whatever this started as, it isn't that anymore. For the first time since the contract had been signed in that cold lawyer's office, Claire let herself believe him completely, without reservation, without the old fear whispering that hope would only lead to greater loss. She did not yet know that Victoria Lane was not finished, that the photograph had only been the opening move in a longer, more dangerous game. But for that night, standing in the quiet study with Daniel's hands wrapped around hers, Claire allowed herself simply to feel safe. The days at Grace's apartment stretched longer than Claire had expected them to. She spent her mornings sitting by the window with a cup of tea, watching the street below, replaying every moment of her marriage from the cold signing at the lawyer's office to the warm, unguarded mornings in the garden, trying to understand where the trust she had built could have been so easily shaken by a single photograph. Grace, ever practical, insisted on keeping her occupied, dragging her out for long walks through the city, filling the apartment with the smell of fresh baking, refusing to let the silence stretch too long between them. You are allowed to be angry and still love him, Grace said one afternoon, kneading dough at the kitchen counter while Claire sat nearby, only half paying attention to the book in her lap. Those two things are not opposites. I know, Claire admitted, but every time I think about trusting him fully, I hear Victoria's voice, and I wonder if I'm just choosing to believe what's easier. Or, maybe you're choosing to believe what's true, and Victoria is just very good at making the truth harder to see. Grace wiped her hands on her apron and sat down across from her friend. You've known Daniel for what, 2 months now? I've known you for over a decade, and even I can see the difference in you since you married him. You laugh more. You stand taller. Whatever this marriage started as, it isn't hurting you the way you're afraid it might. Claire considered this in silence, turning the pages of her book without truly reading them, her mind circling back again and again to the photograph, to Daniel's face when he explained it, to the quiet sincerity that had never once wavered even when she pushed him away. Meanwhile, at the office, Daniel found himself unable to focus on anything beyond the empty space Claire's absence had left in his life. Meetings blurred together. Contracts he would normally review with careful precision sat untouched on his desk, and even Nathan's usual attempts at humor failed to draw more than a distracted nod from his friend. You need to eat something, Nathan said one evening, setting a takeout container in front of Daniel, who had not left his office in nearly 10 hours. And you need to stop pretending that burying yourself in work is going to fix whatever is broken at home. I'm not pretending anything, Daniel said, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. I'm trying to keep this company steady while my personal life falls apart around me. Your personal life is falling apart because you're letting it, Nathan countered. Claire didn't leave because she stopped caring, Daniel. She left because she cares enough that Victoria's games actually hurt her. That's not something you fix by hiding in this office. That's something you fix by showing up, honestly, and proving to her that you're worth the risk of trusting again. Daniel stared at the untouched food in front of him, Nathan's words settling uncomfortably close to truths he had been avoiding since Claire's note appeared on the kitchen table. He thought of his brother, of how quickly life could be taken away without warning, and felt, for the first time in years, a genuine fear of losing something before he had the chance to fight properly for it. The following morning, instead of heading to the office, Daniel drove to the small flower market near the edge of the city, a place he vaguely remembered Claire mentioning once, back when she spoke briefly of the shop she had always dreamed of owning. He wandered through the stalls awkwardly, unfamiliar with flowers beyond their price tags, until an elderly vendor took pity on him and helped him choose a modest bouquet of white roses, the same variety, though he did not realize it yet, that had once filled his brother's garden. He did not deliver them himself. He was not yet ready to face her directly, uncertain if she would even open the door. Instead, he had them delivered to Grace's apartment with a short, handwritten note tucked among the stems. I am not asking you to forgive anything yet. I am only asking you to remember that what grew between us was real, even if it is still fragile enough to be hurt by someone determined to break it. Take whatever time you need. I will be here when you are ready. Claire found the flowers waiting on the kitchen table when she returned from her walk with Grace, and she stood staring at them for a long moment before picking up the note, reading it twice, then a third time, feeling something in her chest loosen slightly for the first time in days. He sent flowers, Grace observed unnecessarily, watching her friend's expression carefully. White roses, Claire said quietly, like the ones in his garden, Ethan's garden. Grace raised an eyebrow. That doesn't sound like a coincidence to me. Claire did not respond, but she kept the roses in a vase by her window for the rest of her stay, watching them each morning as she drank her tea, allowing herself, slowly, to remember the good alongside the fear, the warmth alongside the doubt, until the balance between them finally tipped in favor of going home. When Claire finally decided to return, she did not call ahead. She wanted to see Daniel's honest reaction, unguarded and unprepared, the same way she had once seen him startled by the smell of a simple meal cooking in his kitchen. She found him in the study, exactly where she expected, and the conversation that followed brought them, finally, back to the fragile trust they had built before the photograph arrived, though both of them now understood how easily that trust could still be tested. The knock at the door came just after midnight, urgent and unrelenting, pulling Daniel from his desk and down the stairs before Claire had even fully woken. When he opened it, Victoria Lane stood on the doorstep, mascara smudged beneath her eyes, her hands trembling as she clutched her phone. I need to talk to you, she said, her voice thick with practiced desperation. Please, Daniel, it's important. Against every instinct telling him to close the door, Daniel stepped outside, careful to keep his voice low so it would not wake Claire. Whatever this is, it needs to happen somewhere else, not here. It's about the merger, Victoria said quickly. I have information that could hurt the company, hurt everything you and your mother built. I only came because I still care what happens to you, despite everything. Daniel hesitated. The company had been the reason for this marriage in the first place, the fragile thread holding together his mother's legacy and his brother's memory. He could not simply dismiss a threat against it, no matter how much he distrusted the woman delivering the warning. 10 minutes, he said finally. In the car, not inside. What Daniel did not know was that Victoria had already arranged for someone to be watching, a photographer positioned across the street with a long lens, capturing the image of Daniel leaning into Victoria's car in the darkness of midnight, capturing nothing of the tense, guarded conversation taking place inside, only the appearance of two people meeting in secret. By morning, the photograph had found its way into Claire's phone again, this time accompanied by a message claiming that Daniel had been seen leaving Victoria's car well past 1 a.m, that the marriage everyone whispered about was exactly the empty arrangement people suspected it to be. Claire found Daniel in the kitchen, already dressed for work, and set the phone down in front of him without a word. Victoria came to the house last night, Daniel said immediately, seeing the image before Claire had to explain. She claimed she had information about the merger. I went outside to talk to her because I didn't want to wake you, and because ignoring a threat to the company felt reckless. You met her outside at midnight and didn't think to tell me this morning? Claire's voice was quiet, but the hurt beneath it was unmistakable. I was going to. I only got up an hour before you did. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, frustration mounting. Claire, I know how this looks, but I promise you, nothing happened. She fed me some vague warning about the company that turned out to be nothing at all. I think she only wanted an excuse to see me. Claire wanted desperately to believe him, and some part of her did. But the pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. Secret meetings, photographs appearing at exactly the right moment to cause the most damage. A woman who clearly had no intention of letting go quietly. This cannot keep happening, Claire said. Every time we take one step forward, she finds a way to pull us 3 steps back. I need you to handle this, Daniel. Not for my sake alone, but because I refuse to spend my marriage waiting for the next photograph to arrive. I will, Daniel promised. I'll speak to her directly. Make it clear this needs to stop. But Nathan Cole, arriving at the office later that morning, brought news that complicated things further. He had spoken with a mutual contact who confirmed that Victoria had been the one orchestrating both photographs, hiring someone to follow Daniel and capture images designed to look far more damning than the truth behind them. "She's not doing this out of heartbreak," Nathan said grimly. "She's doing this because she believes if she pushes hard enough, your marriage will collapse under the pressure, and she'll be there waiting when it does." Daniel's expression darkened. "Then I need to end this today. Publicly, clearly. So there's no room left for her to twist anything." He arranged to meet Victoria that afternoon, at a public cafe rather than anywhere private, determined to leave no opportunity for further manipulation. When she arrived, composed and confident, despite the confrontation she surely anticipated, Daniel wasted no time. "Whatever you're trying to do, it stops now," he said, his voice low but firm. "I know about the photographs. I know you arranged for someone to follow me. If it happens again, I will make sure everyone in our industry knows exactly the kind of games you're willing to play to hurt someone's marriage." Victoria's composed mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something rawer underneath, a mixture of anger and genuine hurt that had curdled over the years into something far uglier. "You think I don't know what I lost when you chose the company over me? I waited for you, Daniel. I waited through your grief, through every excuse you made for pushing me away, and the moment you needed a convenient wife to save your precious legacy, you found one in a matter of weeks. That's not what happened, and you know it," Daniel said. "You left because you couldn't handle standing beside someone who was grieving instead of celebrating. That was your choice, not mine." Victoria's jaw tightened, but she said nothing further, and Daniel took her silence as confirmation enough. He left the cafe without waiting for a response, believing the matter finally settled. He did not know that Victoria, wounded and unwilling to accept defeat quietly, had one final move already in motion. A private investigator's report detailing an old, one-time indiscretion from years before the wedding, an evening from Daniel's grief-stricken past that he had never told Claire about because it belonged to a version of himself he barely recognized anymore. The report arrived at the house 3 days later, delivered not to Daniel but directly to Claire, wrapped in an anonymous envelope with no return address. Claire read it alone in her room, her hands growing colder with every line, learning of a night nearly 5 years earlier when a grieving, directionless Daniel had made a choice he was not proud of, a choice that had nothing to do with their marriage, but everything to do with the pattern Victoria was determined to prove existed. When Daniel came home that evening, he found Claire sitting perfectly still in the living room, the envelope resting on the table before her, her face pale and unreadable. "What is this?" she asked, though she already knew, though she had already read every word twice. Daniel's stomach dropped as he recognized the papers. "Claire, that happened years before I ever met you, before any of this. I was drowning in grief. I made a mistake, and I have regretted it every day since." "That's not the point," Claire said, her voice trembling now despite her efforts to stay composed. "The point is that Victoria knew exactly how to find this, exactly when to use it, and I am so tired of feeling like every piece of our life together is a battlefield she gets to control. Then let me end it, completely. Let me make sure there is nothing left for her to use against us." Daniel knelt in front of her, taking her hands, desperate now in a way he had never allowed himself to be. "I cannot change my past, Claire. But I can promise you my future, if you'll still let me." Claire looked at him for a long, silent moment, torn between the ache of old wounds reopened by a stranger's cruelty and the steady sincerity in the eyes of the man kneeling before her. "I need time," she finally said, echoing words she had spoken once before, though this time the distance between them felt far more dangerous. She did not leave that night, but something had shifted, a crack widening beneath the fragile foundation they had spent weeks carefully building. Daniel felt it too, lying awake long after Claire had retreated to her room, aware that Victoria's campaign had done exactly what it was designed to do, planting doubt deep enough that even the truth might not be enough to uproot it completely. Somewhere across the city, Victoria Lane sat in her apartment, satisfied with the chaos she had unleashed, unaware that her final move had not brought Daniel back to her, only pushed him and Claire toward a reckoning neither of them was prepared for. In the days that followed the confrontation at the cafe, Claire tried to return to the fragile normalcy they had rebuilt after the first photograph, but something in the air of the house had changed, a wariness that had not existed before, a habit of glancing at phones a little too quickly whenever they buzzed. She hated the way suspicion had crept back into her thoughts, hated more that she could not seem to shake it no matter how much she trusted the man she had married. Daniel noticed the shift too, and it frustrated him in ways he struggled to express. He had done everything he believed necessary, confronted Victoria directly, been honest about the meeting, honest about the history between them. Yet the doubt lingered, and some evenings he caught Claire watching him with an expression he could not quite read, somewhere between hope and quiet, guarded fear. "I keep waiting for the next thing to go wrong," Claire admitted one night, as they sat together in the garden they had spent so many weekend mornings restoring. "It isn't fair to you, I know, but I can't seem to stop bracing for it." "I understand," Daniel said, though the words carried a weariness he could not fully hide. "I wish I could promise you nothing else will happen, but I can promise that whatever does happen, I won't hide it from you. Not again." It was a promise tested sooner than either of them expected. 2 days later, Nathan arrived at the house unannounced, his expression grim in a way that immediately set Daniel on edge. "There's something you need to see," Nathan said, holding up a manila folder. "I wasn't looking for this. It came to me through a contact who handles some of the company's security concerns. Victoria hired a private investigator months ago, Daniel, before the wedding even happened." Daniel's stomach turned cold. Months ago? Why would she need an investigator before Claire and I were even married? Because she suspected the merger was coming, and she wanted leverage in case it happened. "This isn't just jealousy over losing you personally. She's been building a file on your family for a long time, waiting for the right moment to use whatever she found." Nathan set the folder down carefully on the table. "That report about your past, the one that ended up in Claire's hands, it's only part of what's in here." Daniel opened the folder with hands that were not quite steady, flipping through pages of financial records, old correspondence, details about Evelyn's early struggles with the company after Ethan's death. Details Daniel had never realized anyone outside the family knew. It was more than a betrayal born of heartbreak. It was calculated, patient, and far more dangerous than he had allowed himself to believe. "I need to tell Claire everything," Daniel said, closing the folder. "All of it, not just the parts I've already admitted to." Nathan nodded slowly. "I think that's the only way through this now. Half-truths only give Victoria more room to work with." That evening, Daniel sat Claire down and laid out everything Nathan had uncovered, the months of planning, the careful patience behind Victoria's campaign, the realization that this had never truly been about heartbreak at all, but about control, about refusing to accept that Daniel's life had moved forward without her in it. Claire listened in silence, her expression shifting from confusion to anger to a kind of exhausted clarity as the full picture finally came into focus. "She's been planning this since before we even married," Claire said quietly, almost disbelieving despite everything Daniel had just told her. "This was never really about us at all, was it? It was about her refusing to lose." "I think that's exactly what it was," Daniel said, "and I let her get away with it for too long, because I underestimated how far she was willing to go." Claire looked at the folder still resting on the table between them, at the evidence of a scheme far more calculated than either of them had first imagined. "What do we do now?" "We stop reacting to her, and we start protecting ourselves properly," Daniel said, a new resolve hardening in his voice. "I'm going to speak with our legal team tomorrow. If she's willing to manufacture evidence and hire investigators to interfere with my marriage, that isn't just personal anymore. That's something the company needs to address directly, formally, with consequences she can't simply talk her way around." For the first time since the photographs began arriving, Claire felt something other than fear settle over her, a fragile but growing confidence that this time, they were facing the threat together, honestly, without secrets left unspoken between them. It did not undo the damage of the report that had already been delivered, the wound of Daniel's past exposed in the cruelest possible way. But it gave her, finally, a clearer sense of who the real enemy in this story truly was. And it was not the man sitting across from her, carefully, deliberately choosing honesty over comfort for the first time in longer than either of them cared to admit. The suitcase sat open on the bed, half-packed, when Daniel walked into Claire's room and found her folding clothes with hands that would not stay steady. He stopped in the doorway, his chest tightening at the sight. "Where are you going?" he asked, though the answer was already painfully clear. "To Grace's. For now," Claire said without looking up. "I need to think. Away from this house, away from all of it. Claire, please. We can work through this. I told you the truth about everything, and I meant every word about wanting a future with you." "I know you did." Claire finally looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but dry, exhausted past the point of tears. "But I keep asking myself if I can spend the rest of my life waiting for the next envelope, the next photograph, the next piece of your past that someone digs up to hurt me with. I married you to save my father. I never expected to fall for you. And now that I have, I don't know if I can survive watching it fall apart one revelation at a time." "This isn't falling apart," Daniel said, his voice breaking slightly. This is Victoria trying to make it look that way. Maybe. But even if every word of it was manipulation, the fear underneath it is real, Daniel. I don't know how to build a life on a foundation that keeps shifting under my feet. She closed the suitcase, and Daniel did not stop her when she carried it down the stairs and out to the car Grace had sent for her. He stood on the front steps, watching the taillights disappear down the long driveway, and felt something inside him crack open in a way it had not since the day he learned of his brother's accident. For 2 weeks, Claire stayed with Grace, filing the paperwork for a quiet, uncontested divorce. Her father's health stable enough now that the original reason for the marriage no longer bound her to it. She told herself this was the responsible choice, the safe choice, a way to protect herself from further heartbreak before it could grow any deeper than it already had. But safety, she was discovering, did not feel the way she expected it to. It felt hollow and quiet and far lonelier than she had imagined. Daniel did not call, respecting the space she had asked for, even as it hollowed him out from the inside. He threw himself into work instead, staying at the office until the building emptied around him, until Nathan Cole finally cornered him one evening, unwilling to watch his friend disappear into the same grief that had swallowed him after his brother's death. "You're doing it again," Nathan said, dropping into the chair across from Daniel's desk. "Burying yourself in work instead of dealing with what actually matters." "There's nothing to deal with," Daniel said flatly. "She's filing for divorce. It's done." "It's not done until it's actually done," Nathan countered. "And even then, running from it now instead of fighting for it isn't going to bring you any peace. Trust me. I watched you do this after Ethan died. You built walls so high nobody could reach you, and it took years before you let anyone back in. Do you really want to spend the next few years doing that again, except this time you'll know exactly what you're mourning?" Daniel said nothing, staring at the papers on his desk without truly seeing them. "There's something else," Nathan added, quieter now. "I did some digging of my own after everything with Victoria. She didn't just hire someone to follow you. She paid the investigator who dug up that old report years ago, kept it on hand for exactly this kind of moment. This wasn't a coincidence, Daniel. This was a plan, built over months, maybe longer." Daniel's head snapped up. "You have proof of this?" "Enough to make it very clear to Claire that none of this was really about your past. It was about Victoria's inability to accept that you moved on without her." For the first time since Claire had left, something other than grief moved through Daniel. A sharp, focused determination that pushed through the numbness that had settled over him for 2 weeks. He gathered every piece of evidence Nathan had found, every message, every payment record, every thread connecting Victoria to the campaign designed to destroy his marriage before it could fully take root, and he drove straight to Grace's apartment without calling first. Grace answered the door with her arms crossed, clearly prepared to turn him away, but something in his expression made her pause. "She doesn't want to see you," Grace said, though there was less certainty in her voice than she likely intended. "I'm not here to convince her of anything with words alone," Daniel said. "I have proof, Grace. Proof that everything Victoria did was calculated, planned, meant to tear us apart. Claire deserves to see it, whatever she decides to do afterward." Grace studied him for a long moment, then stepped aside, allowing him into the small living room where Claire sat on the couch, her divorce paperwork spread across the coffee table in front of her. She looked up, startled, when Daniel walked in, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "I'm not here to ask you to stop the paperwork," Daniel said, setting the folder of evidence on the table beside the divorce papers. "I'm here because you deserve the truth, all of it, laid out clearly, instead of scattered in envelopes designed to hurt you. Victoria planned this, all of it. The photographs, the report, the timing. She wanted exactly this outcome, and I refused to let her have it without you at least knowing the full truth." Claire's hands trembled slightly as she opened the folder, reading through the evidence Nathan had gathered. Message after message revealing Victoria's careful, patient campaign to unravel a marriage she could not accept had happened without her. Something cold and clarifying settled over her as she read, not quite relief, but a shift in the fog that had clouded her judgment for weeks. "This doesn't erase what actually happened," Claire said finally, closing the folder. "The night you're ashamed of still happened. Victoria didn't invent that." "No," Daniel agreed. "That was mine, and I own it completely. But everything since then, every doubt she planted between us, every crack she widened, that was deliberate cruelty, not truth revealing itself. I need you to know the difference, even if it doesn't change your decision." Claire sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the 2 piles of paper in front of her, one representing an ending, the other representing a truth she had not fully understood until now. "Why does it matter so much to you, that I know the difference?" Daniel knelt in front of her, the way he had once before, though this time there was no fear left in his voice, only quiet, unguarded honesty. Because I love you, Claire. Not the version of you who saved my company, not the convenient wife my mother arranged. You. The woman who cooked a meal no one asked her to cook, who sat beside her father's hospital bed without ever once feeling sorry for herself, who saw past every wall I built and still chose to stay, until fear and cruelty combined to convince you that staying wasn't safe anymore. Tears finally slipped down Claire's face, the one she had held back for 2 weeks, and Grace quietly excused herself from the room, leaving them alone with everything that had been left unsaid. I don't know if I can just forget the last few weeks, Claire whispered. I'm not asking you to forget, Daniel said. I'm asking for the chance to prove, every single day from here forward, that what we built was never a mistake, that whatever this started as, a contract, a convenience, an obligation, it became something real, and I am not willing to let it end, because someone else decided we didn't deserve a chance to find out how real it could become. Claire looked down at the divorce papers still spread across the table, then back at Daniel, kneeling in front of her with nothing left to hide, no walls left standing between them. The choice, for the first time since the lawyer's office where this had all begun, felt entirely her own. She reached out, slowly, and set her hand over his. I'm not ready to say everything is fixed, she said quietly, but I'm not ready to let it end here either. It was not a full return, not yet, but it was a beginning, fragile and uncertain, built this time not on obligation or fear, but on the honest, hard-won choice of 2 people finally willing to fight for something real. In the quiet days after Claire moved into Grace's apartment, Henry Whitmore, still recovering but steadily regaining his strength, asked his daughter to visit him alone, without Grace hovering nearby with well-meaning distractions. He had heard enough, through careful, worried phone calls, to understand that something had gone deeply wrong, and he wanted to hear the truth from Claire herself. You don't have to protect me from this, Henry said gently, sitting in his favorite chair by the window, color returning slowly to his face with each passing week. I know you agreed to this marriage for my sake. If it has become something that hurts you more than it helps, you owe me no loyalty to stay in it. It's not that simple anymore, Claire admitted, sitting beside him, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she had barely touched. I didn't expect to fall for him, but I did. And now every time something goes wrong, I don't know if I'm protecting myself from a bad marriage or running from a good one out of fear. Henry considered this for a long moment. Your mother and I did not have an easy beginning either, you know. Our families barely approved of the match. There were people in her life who tried very hard to convince her I wasn't worth the trouble. He smiled faintly at the memory. The difference, I think, is that we chose, every single day, to fight for what we were building, instead of retreating every time it became difficult. Love that survives is rarely love that had an easy start. It is love that 2 people decided, again and again, was worth defending. Claire thought of Daniel kneeling before her in the study, of his hands covering hers over his brother's photograph, of the quiet, steady way he had stayed beside her at this very hospital during her father's worst days. I'm afraid that if I go back and it falls apart again, I won't survive it a second time. Or, Henry said softly, you might discover that surviving it, together, is exactly what makes it real. He reached over and took her hand, his grip stronger now than it had been in months. I am not telling you what to do, Claire. I am only telling you that fear makes a very poor advisor when it comes to matters of the heart. Claire left the hospital that evening with her father's words settling heavily and thoughtfully in her mind, though she was not yet ready to act on them. It would take Daniel's arrival at Grace's apartment, folder of evidence in hand, honesty laid bare without reservation, to finally tip the careful balance she had been holding on to for 2 long weeks. After Daniel left that evening, having secured not a full reconciliation but the fragile beginning of one, Claire sat alone in Grace's living room for a long while, staring at the space where the divorce papers had rested only hours earlier. Grace returned eventually, sensing the shift in the apartment's atmosphere before Claire even said a word. So, Grace said carefully, settling onto the couch beside her, are congratulations in order, or is it too soon to ask? Claire allowed herself a small, tired laugh. It's not fixed. Not completely. But I think, for the first time since this all started, I actually believe we could get there. That's more than you've said in 2 weeks, Grace observed gently. What changed? He didn't just tell me he was sorry, Claire said, thinking of the folder still resting on the coffee table. He showed me the truth, all of it, even the parts that made him look weak or foolish. He didn't try to control the story anymore. He just handed me everything and let me decide what to do with it. She paused, turning the words over carefully. I think that's the difference between someone who wants to be forgiven and someone who actually wants to be known, completely, mistakes and all. Grace studied her friend for a long moment, then reached over and squeezed her hand. For what it's worth, I think that's the kind of love worth going back for. Claire returned home 3 days later, not because every doubt had been resolved, but because she had finally understood, the way her father had tried gently to tell her, that real love was not the absence of difficulty, but the willingness of two people to keep choosing each other through it. The house felt different when she walked back through its doors, not because anything about its rooms had physically changed, but because she herself had changed within it, no longer a reluctant bride counting the days until obligation released her, but a woman who had chosen, deliberately and with open eyes, to stay. Daniel met her in the entryway, uncertain at first whether to embrace her or simply wait for her to close the distance herself. Claire made the choice for both of them, crossing the space and wrapping her arms around him, feeling him exhale slowly, as though he had been holding his breath since the moment she left. "I'm not saying everything is healed," she murmured against his shoulder, "but I'm here, and I want to try, properly this time, without secrets standing between us." "Properly," Daniel agreed, his voice thick with relief. "No more secrets. I promise you that, completely." It was not the end of their difficulties, not yet, but it was the true beginning of the marriage neither of them had expected to find within the cold terms of a business contract, a beginning built this time on honesty, on hard choices made freely, and on the quiet, steady belief that whatever came next, they would face it together. Nathan Cole, when he heard the news the following morning, allowed himself a rare, genuine smile as he set a fresh cup of coffee on Daniel's desk. "So the folder worked," he said, not quite a question. "The truth worked," Daniel corrected, though there was no real argument in his tone. "The folder just made sure there was nothing left to hide behind." "And Victoria?" Nathan asked. "The legal team is drafting a formal notice today. Harassment, interference, misuse of private investigation services against a private citizen. She has until the end of the week to respond before we take it further." Daniel's voice carried none of the old hesitation that had once made him reluctant to confront her directly. "I should have done this the moment the first photograph arrived." "You did it the moment it mattered," Nathan said. "Better late with the right approach than early with the wrong one." Daniel nodded, though his thoughts had already drifted back to the house, to Claire, to the fragile, hopeful quiet that had settled over their home since her return. Whatever consequences awaited Victoria, they no longer felt like the most important part of the story. That part, Daniel understood now, belonged entirely to the two of them, and to the future they were only just beginning, cautiously and honestly, to build. The morning sun spilled through the windows of Grace's small apartment when Claire finally agreed to come home, though she made it clear to Daniel that home would need to mean something different this time, not a house of separate rooms and careful distances, but a place built together, deliberately, with honesty as its foundation. Daniel accepted every condition without argument. He canceled a week of meetings, something Nathan Cole had never once seen him do in the years they had worked together, and spent that time simply being present, learning the small details of Claire's life he had overlooked in the rush of contracts and company obligations. He learned that she took her tea with honey, never sugar. He learned that she hummed old songs her mother used to sing while she gardened. He learned that her laugh, when it was real and unguarded, sounded nothing like the polite, careful sound she had offered at company events, and he found himself doing whatever he could to earn that real laugh as often as possible. But Victoria Lane was not finished, not entirely. Word of the evidence Daniel had gathered spread quietly through their business circle, and within days, her standing among their shared industry contacts began to crumble under the weight of what she had done. Investors who had once respected her grew wary. Old friends distanced themselves. The isolation she had tried to inflict on Daniel's marriage instead settled over her own life, and though Daniel felt no satisfaction in her downfall, he did feel a quiet sense of closure when Nathan informed him that Victoria had accepted a position overseas, removing herself entirely from the world she had once tried so hard to control. With Victoria's shadow finally lifted, Daniel and Claire found space to breathe, to build something neither obligation nor cruelty had a hand in shaping. Claire's father, Henry Whitmore, continued to recover steadily, strong enough now to sit in the garden behind the house on warm afternoons, watching his daughter and son-in-law with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had once feared he would not live to see his daughter find real happiness, even in circumstances that had begun so far from anything resembling love. One evening, several months after Claire's return, Daniel found her in the garden, kneeling in the soil beside her father's chair, laughing at something Henry had said. her hands dark with dirt and her face bright with an ease Daniel had never seen in her during those first cold weeks of their marriage. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, simply watching, struck by how far they had traveled from that silent, sterile lawyer's office where this had all begun. "You're staring," Claire said without turning around, a small smile tugging at her mouth. "I like what I'm looking at," Daniel replied, crossing the garden to join them. Henry Whitmore reached out and took his daughter's hand, then extended the other toward Daniel, drawing him into the small circle they had formed. "I told you once to take care of her," the old man said, his voice steadier now than it had been in the hospital that first difficult morning. "I should have also told you to let her take care of you. Seems you finally figured that part out on your own." Daniel knelt beside them both, feeling something settle in his chest that had been missing for years, since long before Claire had ever walked into his life, a quiet, steady sense of belonging he had stopped believing he deserved after his brother's death. He looked at Claire, at the soil on her hands and the warmth in her eyes, and understood, finally, that everything he had once measured in contracts and company value meant nothing compared to this. "I used to think love was something that happened to other people," Daniel said quietly, mostly to Claire, though Henry listened with a knowing smile. "Something reckless, something I couldn't afford to want after everything I lost. I built my whole life around the idea that if I never let myself hope for it, I could never be hurt by losing it again. And now?" Claire asked softly. "Now I know that avoiding the risk of losing something only guaranteed I would never truly have it in the first place." Daniel took her hand, the soil and all, and pressed it gently to his chest. "I married you for convenience, Claire. I want you to know, clearly, without any doubt left between us, that I choose you now for love, not because a contract demands it, not because my mother arranged it. Because somewhere between that cold signing and this garden, you became the only thing in my life I am not willing to lose." Claire's eyes filled with tears, though this time they carried none of the fear or grief of the weeks before, only the quiet fullness of a promise finally, completely believed. "I think some part of me knew, even that first night in your house, alone in that unfamiliar room, that this could become something real, if we both let it. I just didn't dare hope for it out loud." "Then hope for it now," Daniel said. "Out loud, and often, for as long as you'll let me hear it." Henry Whitmore watched his daughter and her husband with tears of his own, grateful beyond words that the sacrifice she had made for his sake had led, against every reasonable expectation, to a happiness neither of them could have predicted the day that contract was signed. In the months that followed, the house that had once felt too large and too empty slowly filled with warmth, laughter echoing through hallways that had known only careful silence before. Claire redecorated the long dining table, no longer a symbol of a family that did not yet exist, but the gathering place for dinners shared every evening without exception, filled with easy conversation and, eventually, plans for the family they hoped to build together. Evelyn Hart, softened by the transformation she witnessed in her son, visited more often, and though she would never fully abandon her sharp, calculating edges, she found herself genuinely welcoming Claire into the family, in ways she had never expected when she first arranged the marriage purely to save the company. "I only wanted to protect what was left after Ethan," Evelyn admitted to Claire one afternoon, watching Daniel laugh freely in the garden with Henry, a sound she had feared she would never hear from her remaining son again. "I never imagined the arrangement I built out of fear would give him back the part of himself I thought he had lost forever." "Sometimes the hardest beginnings lead to the truest endings," Claire replied, watching her husband with a quiet, steady love that no longer carried any trace of doubt. A year after the cold, silent wedding that had begun their story, Daniel and Claire renewed their vows in the same garden where he had finally told her the truth of his heart, surrounded not by lawyers and business partners, but by the people who had come to matter most: Henry, Evelyn, Grace, and Nathan, all witnesses now to a marriage built not on convenience, but on the hard-won, deliberate choice of two people who had almost let fear and manipulation cost them everything. Daniel took Claire's hands beneath the same sky where he had once knelt and confessed his love without reservation, and this time, when he said the words he was choosing her, his voice did not carry the flat, careful tone of the courthouse contract. It carried everything he had once believed he could not afford to feel again: warmth, hope, and a love he now understood was never a weakness, but the greatest strength he had ever allowed himself to hold. "I married you for convenience," he said softly, echoing words that had once defined the coldest chapter of his life, "and I nearly lost you before I understood what I truly had. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to wonder again which one of those beginnings this marriage was truly built on." Claire smiled through her tears, certain now, completely and without fear, that whatever had brought them together at the start, love had long since become the only thing holding them, unshakably, in place. The formal notice Daniel's legal team sent to Victoria Lane arrived at the end of that same week, and true to the pattern Nathan had predicted, she did not fight it. Faced with the possibility of a public dispute that would expose her own methods far more damagingly than anything she had managed to leak about Daniel, Victoria quietly agreed to every condition placed before her: a cessation of contact, a formal acknowledgement of the private investigator's misuse, and a quiet, permanent step back from the circle of business and social contacts she had once moved through so confidently. Daniel felt no triumph in her retreat, only a steady, settling relief that the shadow hanging over his marriage had finally, completely lifted. He mentioned it to Claire only briefly one evening, wanting her to know without dwelling on it longer than necessary. "It's over," he said simply, finding her in the kitchen, humming to herself while she prepared dinner, a habit that had become one of his favorite sounds in the house. "Officially, legally, there won't be any more photographs, any more envelopes." Claire set down the knife she had been using and turned to face him fully. "How do you feel?" Daniel considered the question honestly before answering. "Lighter. Like I've been carrying something for years I didn't even realize was still weighing on me, and now it's finally gone." "Good," Claire said softly, crossing the kitchen to wrap her arms around him. "Because I'd like us to stop looking over our shoulders and start actually enjoying what we've built." It was a season of quiet rebuilding after that, weeks that stretched into months of ordinary, unremarkable happiness, the kind neither of them had believed themselves capable of finding within a marriage that had started as nothing more than a practical arrangement. Daniel began arriving home earlier not out of obligation but simple eagerness, and Claire found herself no longer counting the hours until he returned, but instead genuinely surprised by how quickly the days passed when they were spent together. The garden they had restored together bloomed fully that spring, roses climbing along the fence in colors that seemed almost too vivid against the gray stone of the house, and Henry Whitmore, strong enough now to travel short distances on his own, became a frequent visitor, spending long afternoons in the garden with his daughter, and the son-in-law he had once worried might never learn to open his heart fully to her. It was during one of these afternoons, watching Daniel patiently help Henry tend to a stubborn patch of tomatoes near the garden's edge, that Claire realized how completely her life had transformed from the cold, uncertain days following that first signing at the lawyer's office. She thought of the woman she had been then, bracing herself against a marriage she expected to endure rather than enjoy, and felt a quiet, grateful astonishment at how far they had traveled since. Evelyn Hart, too, found herself softening in ways she had not expected when she first orchestrated the marriage to save her company's future. She began visiting more frequently, no longer arriving with the sharp, appraising energy of someone inspecting an investment, but with the gentler curiosity of a mother finally allowing herself to hope that her remaining son might build a life beyond grief and obligation. "I owe you an apology," Evelyn admitted to Claire one afternoon, the two of them sitting together on the porch while Daniel and Henry worked in the garden below. "I arranged this marriage without any concern for what it might cost you personally. I saw only the company, only what needed saving. I never imagined it might also save my son, in ways I had stopped believing were possible." "You don't owe me an apology," Claire said gently. "You gave us the chance to find this, even if that wasn't your intention at the start. Sometimes that's enough." Evelyn studied her for a long moment, something like genuine warmth passing across features that had rarely allowed themselves such softness. "You are a far better daughter-in-law than I deserve, after everything I put you through to secure this marriage. Then let's simply agree to move forward from here," Claire said, rather than measuring what came before. It was in that spirit of moving forward that Daniel began planning, quietly, the vow renewal that would take place nearly a year after their original wedding, wanting to give Claire the ceremony their first ceremony had never truly been. A celebration chosen freely rather than a formality endured out of necessity. He enlisted Grace's help in the planning, wanting every detail to reflect the life they had actually built together, rather than the image his mother had once carefully curated for their original wedding day. "He asked me to help him pick flowers," Grace confided to Claire one afternoon, feigning exasperation though her eyes shone with genuine happiness for her friend. "As if I know the first thing about flowers. I told him to just ask you directly, but apparently that would ruin the surprise." Claire laughed, imagining Daniel standing awkwardly among flower stalls, trying to choose blooms without giving away his plans. "He's terrible at keeping secrets, you know. I've already guessed at least half of what he's planning. Let him have this," Grace said, smiling. "After everything you two went through to get here, I think he deserves the chance to surprise you with something good for once." The morning of the renewal ceremony arrived warm and clear, the garden transformed with strings of soft lights woven through the rose bushes Claire had spent so many early mornings restoring by hand. She stood in front of the mirror in a dress she had chosen herself this time, simpler than the one she had worn to their first wedding but far more meaningful for the choice behind it, and felt none of the cold uncertainty that had gripped her a year earlier. Grace helped fasten the last few buttons along her back, catching Claire's eye in the mirror. "Nervous?" "Not the way I was last time," Claire admitted. "Last time I was terrified of a future I didn't choose. Today I just feel grateful for one I did." Downstairs, Henry Whitmore waited to walk his daughter into the garden, dressed in his finest suit, his color full and healthy in a way that still occasionally brought tears to Claire's eyes when she remembered how close she had once come to losing him entirely. He took her arm gently as they reached the garden entrance, pausing before they stepped through. "I never thought I would live to see this day," he said quietly. "Not the wedding day itself, but this one, the one that actually means what it says." "You gave me the chance to find it," Claire said, squeezing his arm. "Whatever else happened, I would make the same choice again, knowing everything I know now." They walked together into the garden, where Daniel stood waiting beneath an arch woven with white roses, the same variety that had once grown wild and neglected before Claire's careful hands brought them back to life. His eyes found hers immediately, and whatever nervousness he had carried through the morning's preparations dissolved entirely at the sight of her. The ceremony itself was brief, intimate, filled with the small handful of people who had witnessed every difficult step of their journey to this moment: Henry, Evelyn, Grace, and Nathan, standing together as both witnesses and, in every meaningful sense, family. There were no lawyers this time, no careful business language disguising a personal arrangement. There was only the honest exchange of two people who had already tested their commitment against real difficulty and chosen, deliberately, to keep building forward. 3 years later, the sound of small footsteps running across the wooden floors had become the most familiar noise in the house, chasing away the last traces of the silence that once filled every hallway. Their daughter, Lily, had her mother's steady gaze and her father's stubborn determination, and she ran now toward the garden gate where Daniel knelt, waiting with his arms open. "Papa, look what I found," Lily called, holding up a smooth gray stone she had pulled from beneath the roses. "That's a fine treasure," Daniel said, lifting her onto his hip as Claire watched from the porch, a warmth in her chest that still, after all this time, caught her by surprise some mornings, when she woke and remembered how close they had once come to losing all of this. Henry Whitmore's health had remained steady in the years since his illness, strong enough now that he insisted on teaching his granddaughter how to plant tomatoes each spring, a small ritual that had become sacred to all 3 generations. He sat now in his usual chair beneath the old oak tree, watching Daniel spin Lily in slow circles while she laughed, and he thought, not for the first time, how strange and beautiful it was that a contract signed to save his life had somehow grown into a family neither he nor his daughter could have imagined at the start. The company, too, had grown steadier in those years, no longer teetering on the edge of collapse the way it had when Evelyn first arranged the marriage out of desperation. Daniel had restructured much of the business himself, stepping back from the relentless hours that once consumed him, trusting Nathan Cole with greater responsibility, so that evenings and weekends could belong to his family, instead of endless negotiations. It was a decision that would have been unthinkable to the guarded, grieving man who once signed a marriage contract without blinking, but it came easily now, a natural extension of everything he had learned about what truly mattered. Victoria Lane's name rarely surfaced anymore, mentioned only in passing when old business contacts reminisced about the industry's more turbulent years. She had built a new life overseas, and whatever bitterness once drove her to unravel a marriage she could not accept had, according to the occasional rumor that reached them, softened with distance and time. Daniel felt no need to revisit that chapter, no lingering resentment worth carrying forward into the life he had built since. It belonged to the past, exactly where it deserved to stay. Grace Bennett had become a permanent fixture in their lives, not simply Claire's closest friend but something closer to family, spending nearly every weekend at the house, teasing Daniel about how far he had come from the stern, unreadable man she had once distrusted on Claire's behalf. She often reminded them both, especially during the quiet evenings when Lily had finally fallen asleep and the 3 of them sat together on the porch, how close everything had come to falling apart during those difficult weeks years earlier. "I still remember the day you showed up at my apartment with that folder of evidence," Grace said one evening, swirling the wine in her glass. "I almost didn't let you in." "I'm glad you did," Daniel replied, glancing toward the window where Claire stood humming softly, while she tidied the kitchen. The same old songs her mother used to sing, now hummed just as often to their daughter. "So am I," Grace admitted. "Watching you two now, it's hard to believe how cold that first meeting was, back when you signed those papers like you were closing a business deal." "In some ways we were," Claire said, joining them on the porch with a fresh pot of tea. "But even the coldest beginnings can grow into something warm, if both people are willing to fight for it, once it starts to matter." Evelyn Hart visited often now, her sharp edges softened further with each passing year, especially whenever she watched her granddaughter run through the garden with the same reckless joy Daniel once had, before grief had hardened him into someone who nearly forgot how to feel it. She had long since stopped viewing Claire as merely the woman who had saved the family company, and had come instead to see her as the daughter she had never had, someone whose quiet strength had ultimately given her back the son she feared she had lost for good after Ethan's death. "You gave him back to me," Evelyn told Claire quietly one afternoon, watching Daniel teach Lily how to skip stones across the small pond at the edge of the property. Not the company, not the merger. Him. The boy who used to laugh like that before everything went wrong. Claire smiled, watching the same scene, her heart full in a way she still sometimes struggled to put into words. He gave himself back in the end. I only reminded him it was possible. That evening, after Lily had finally been coaxed to sleep and the house settled into its familiar, comfortable quiet, Daniel found Claire in the garden where their story had, in many ways, truly begun, kneeling beside the same roses Lily had explored earlier that day. He sat down beside her, the night air cool and gentle around them. "Do you ever think about that first night?" he asked. "In the house, when I left you alone and went straight to my office?" "Sometimes," Claire admitted. "It feels like a different lifetime now. I remember sitting on that bed, telling myself I would never expect anything more than what the contract promised. I was so certain I would spend this marriage protecting my heart from exactly this. And now?" Claire leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the stars begin to appear over the quiet garden. "Now I can't imagine having protected myself from any of it. Not the fear, not the uncertainty, none of it. Because all of that led here, to this exact moment, and I would not trade this for the safest, emptiest life imaginable." Daniel wrapped his arm around her, pulling her closer, thinking of every version of himself that had existed before this moment. The grieving boy who lost his brother, the guarded businessman who signed a contract instead of a vow, the desperate man kneeling in Grace's apartment with nothing left to offer but the truth. Every one of those versions had led him here, to a garden, a family, a love he had once believed himself unworthy of ever holding. "I used to think losing you was the greatest regret I could imagine," he said quietly. "I still believe that, but I think the greater truth is that finding you, and choosing to fight for you when it would have been easier to let you go, became the greatest decision I ever made." Claire turned to look at him, the same steady gaze that had first caught his attention in a cold lawyer's office years before, now softened entirely by everything they had built since. "Then let's keep choosing each other," she said. "Every day, for as long as we have." "Every day," Daniel agreed, and beneath the quiet stars, in the garden where fear had once nearly cost them everything, they sealed that promise the way they always did now, not with contracts or careful words, but with the simple, steady certainty of two people who had learned, the hard way, exactly what it meant to choose love over convenience, and never let go again. Lily's 5th birthday arrived that same spring, and the garden once again became the center of the household celebrations, filled this time with the laughter of small children chasing each other between the rose bushes, while Daniel and Claire watched from the porch, hands intertwined in the easy, unthinking way that had become second nature to them both. Henry Whitmore sat nearby, a paper crown perched slightly crooked on his head, courtesy of his granddaughter's insistence that everyone at the party wear one. He caught Claire's eye across the garden and smiled, the same warm, grateful smile he had worn so often in the years since his health had stabilized. A smile that still carried, beneath its warmth, the quiet memory of how close they had all once come to a very different outcome. "She has your laugh," Henry said, when Claire came to sit beside him for a moment, watching Lily attempt to catch bubbles that Nathan Cole was blowing for the delighted group of children. "She has your stubbornness," Claire replied, smiling as Lily insisted on catching every single bubble herself, refusing help from any of the older children nearby. "A fine combination, I think," Henry said, watching his granddaughter with quiet pride, "though I suspect she'll need every bit of it, growing up in this family." Later that evening, after the last of the guests had gone and Lily had finally succumbed to exhausted sleep despite her best efforts to stay awake for just a little longer, Daniel and Claire sat together on the porch steps, the garden quiet again around them. string lights glowing softly among the roses. Nathan asked me today if I ever regret how it all started, Daniel said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. The contract, the arrangement, all of it. What did you tell him? I told him that if it hadn't started that way, I might never have found the courage to let myself want something real again. Sometimes the hardest beginnings are the ones that force you to choose honesty over comfort, eventually. Daniel glanced over at her, the porch light softening his features. I don't regret any of it. Not the contract, not the difficulty, not even Victoria, as strange as that sounds. Everything that happened led us here. Claire rested her head against his shoulder, watching the last of the daylight fade behind the garden's edge. I used to think love had to start gently to become something lasting. I don't believe that anymore. I think it just has to be honest, eventually, no matter how it begins. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, listening to the quiet sounds of the evening settling around them, the distant hum of the city beyond their garden walls, the soft rustle of roses in the evening breeze. Somewhere upstairs, Lily slept peacefully, unaware of how much had been overcome to give her the steady, loving family she now took entirely for granted, the way children are meant to take such things for granted. Do you ever think about what would have happened? Claire asked quietly, if I hadn't come back, after Grace's apartment? Daniel considered the question seriously before answering. I think about it sometimes, yes. I think I would have spent years exactly the way I spent the time after Ethan died, working myself into exhaustion to avoid feeling anything at all. I don't think I would have let myself love anyone again, not fully, not after losing you on top of everything else. He turned to look at her directly. You didn't just come back to a marriage, Claire. You gave me back a version of myself I thought I had lost for good. We gave each other that, Claire corrected gently. I was just as lost as you were, in my own way, afraid to hope for anything beyond survival. Then I suppose we found our way back together, Daniel said, pulling her closer against the cool evening air. Above them, the first stars began to appear over the garden, the same garden where fear had once nearly cost them the life they now shared so completely, and where, years later, their daughter would grow up believing love simply looked like this, steady and warm, and utterly certain, never once imagining the fragile, uncertain beginning from which it had actually grown. In the years that followed, the story of their marriage became something quietly told among family gatherings, softened by time into a tale of two people who had found their way to love through unexpected circumstances, the harder chapters worn smooth by the happiness that eventually followed. But for Daniel and Claire, the memory remained sharper, more precious for the difficulty it had survived, a reminder, whenever life presented new challenges, that the greatest regrets often become the foundation for the deepest gratitude. If two people are willing to choose each other, honestly and completely, again and again, for as long as they both shall live.